I never told my arrogant stepfather that I was the founder and chief executive officer of the exact private equity firm he was desperately begging for a financial bailout. For 15 long years, I played the role of the quiet, obedient daughter, always swallowing his bitter insults about my cheap clothes and my boring office job. He truly thought I was just a lowly paper pusher who was dragging down his flawless, wealthy image. Then one Tuesday morning, my phone buzzed with a secret emergency code from my mother. It included a location pin from inside his own sprawling mansion. 15 minutes later, I forced my way through his custom mahogany front door, and he finally began to learn exactly who he had been messing with all these years. Before I dive deep into this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever silently outsmarted someone who completely underestimated your worth. The morning everything shattered, I was sitting at the head of a massive glass conference table in downtown Atlanta. As a 32-year-old Black woman running Vanguard Acquisitions, I was used to high-stakes environments. I was in the middle of orchestrating a corporate takeover of a failing supply chain conglomerate. The room was filled with tense executives waiting for my final decision on the buyout structure. The air conditioning hummed quietly against the heavy silence of the room. I was just about to reject their counteroffer when a sharp vibration against my leg broke my concentration. I keep a strict rule about personal devices in the boardroom, but I had programmed a specific vibration pattern solely for my mother. I discreetly pulled my phone from my blazer pocket. The screen displayed a single text message from my mother, Loretta. It read simply 911 Pine. Below the text was a live GPS location pin showing she was currently inside my stepfather Desmond's suburban estate. My blood ran completely cold. 911 Pine was not just a random typo. It was a distress code my mother and I had established an entire decade ago. Back then, my mother was a hardworking registered nurse taking on double shifts just to keep us afloat before she met Desmond. He swept in with his flashy logistics company, his tailored suits, and his empty promises of taking care of her forever. Slowly and methodically, he isolated her. He convinced her to quit her nursing job and surrender her retirement accounts to his financial manager so they could build a unified family trust. Once she was entirely dependent on him, his charming facade melted away, revealing a cruel, controlling patriarch. We created that emergency code for one specific reason. If she ever sent it to me, it meant Desmond had crossed the terrifying line from psychological torment to immediate physical danger, and I needed to drop whatever I was doing to get her out. I stood up abruptly, pushing my leather chair back so hard it scraped against the polished floor. The opposing executives stared at me in total shock. I did not offer them an apology or an explanation. I simply looked at my vice president and told him to pause the negotiations indefinitely before walking straight out of the glass doors. I ignored the frantic questions from my assistants as I marched toward the private executive elevator. In the parking garage, I bypassed my chauffeured corporate vehicle and headed straight for the 5-year-old silver sedan I kept specifically to maintain my humble disguise around my family. I slammed the door shut, started the engine, and tore out of the parking structure, breaking multiple speed limits as I raced toward the affluent suburbs. During the agonizing 20-minute drive, my mind raced through 1,000 horrific scenarios. Desmond was a 58-year-old man who commanded his household with a terrifying iron fist. He owned a regional freight company that gave him a massive ego, and he demanded absolute submission from everyone in his orbit. He had always hated me because I never cowered when he raised his voice. To him, I was just a stubborn, ungrateful girl who refused to appreciate the luxurious roof he provided. He constantly ridiculed my modest lifestyle, completely unaware that my simple sedan and off-the-rack blazers were a deliberate shield to prevent him from discovering my immense wealth and draining my accounts like he had done to my mother. I whipped my car into the sprawling, circular driveway of his gated estate, the tires screeching loudly against the pristine decorative gravel. I threw the car into park and sprinted up the wide brick steps toward the massive double doors. Before I could even turn the brass handle, the heavy oak door swung open. Desmond stood there blocking the entrance completely. He was wearing a custom-tailored gray suit, his posture rigid and his face twisted into a mask of arrogant disdain. "What is wrong with you?" he demanded, his voice booming across the quiet neighborhood. "You cannot just park that piece of junk car in my driveway and come stomping up my steps like a wild animal. You are ruining the aesthetic of my home." "Where is my mother?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. Desmond scoffed, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. He crossed his arms over his chest, puffing himself up to intimidate me. "She is currently busy learning how to be a respectful wife," he sneered. "You need to get back in your cheap little car and drive back to whatever miserable cubicle you crawled out of. I am sick of you bringing your low-class energy into my happy household. You are a complete failure of a daughter, and you are not welcome here." He reached forward to slam the heavy door in my face. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice or try to reason with a man who thrived on intimidation. Instead, I planted my feet, dropped my shoulder hard, and rammed my entire body weight directly into the solid wood door. The sudden violent force caught Desmond completely off guard. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the polished marble floor of the foyer. I marched past him into the grand entryway, my eyes scanning the massive open space. What I saw made my heart stop beating entirely. There at the bottom of the sweeping curved staircase sat my mother. She was huddled against the decorative iron railing, trembling uncontrollably. Her hands were covering her face, but as she looked up at me, I saw the deep purple bruising rapidly swelling across her left cheekbone. The pristine illusion of Desmond's perfect, wealthy family was shattered across the marble floor, and in that exact moment, I knew I was going to systematically dismantle his entire life. Desmond let out a roar of absolute fury that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the grand foyer. "How dare you push your way into my house, you ungrateful little brat!" he shouted, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. The heavy thud of his expensive leather shoes slapped against the marble floor as he charged toward me. His hand raised high in the air, curled into a tight fist, ready to strike me down, just as he had clearly struck my mother moments before. I did not flinch. I did not scream or cower or brace for impact. My years in the cutthroat world of corporate acquisitions had trained me to remain completely paralyzed in the face of aggressive men. With a terrifying calmness, I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my phone. My thumb hit the screen recording app in a fraction of a second, and I held the device up, aiming the camera lens directly at his flushed, angry face. "Georgia Code, Section 16521, Aggravated Assault," I stated, my voice dropping to a freezing clinical monotone that sliced right through his screaming. "Punishable by 1 to 20 years in state prison." Combined with Georgia Code Section 16541, false imprisonment for refusing to let my mother leave this property. That carries an additional 1 to 10 years. I am recording your face, your raised fist, and the bruised face of your wife sitting on the floor. Go ahead, Desmond. Take the swing. Give me the exact evidence I need to end your entire existence. His fist froze in mid-air. The sheer clinical precision of my words caught him entirely off guard. He expected a weeping, hysterical daughter. He did not expect a walking legal textbook. His chest heaved as he lowered his hand, his eyes darting to the glowing red recording icon on my phone screen. But Desmond was a man whose ego could never allow him to lose a confrontation in his own home. He quickly masked his hesitation with a loud, mocking laugh. "You really think you are doing something here, do you?" he sneered, taking a step back and smoothing the lapels of his custom suit. "Go ahead and call the police, Nadia. Call them right now. Do you honestly believe the authorities in this affluent neighborhood are going to listen to a broke wage worker who drives a beat-up sedan over one of the highest tax-paying business owners in the city? I play golf with the chief of police. You are nothing but a miserable clerk trying to play hero. You will be laughed out of the precinct, and I will have you arrested for trespassing." Before I could respond to his pathetic display of arrogance, I felt a weak tug on the hem of my pants. I looked down to see my mother scrambling to her feet, her hands shaking violently. She reached out and pushed my phone downward, her eyes wide with absolute terror. "Nadia, please do not call them," she sobbed, her voice hoarse and broken. "Please put the phone away. He will take everything." "Mom, look at your face," I said softly, keeping my eyes locked on Desmond. "He cannot get away with this. We are leaving and we are calling the authorities." "You do not understand, Nadia." She wept, clinging to my arm. "He has everything. He made me take my name off the joint savings accounts last year. He told me it was for tax purposes, but now I cannot access a single dime. He even took control of my nursing pension to invest in his logistics company. My credit cards are frozen. If you call the police and he gets arrested, his lawyers will freeze the remaining accounts, and I will have nothing. I will be out on the street with $0 to my name. I cannot afford to start over at 55. Please, Nadia, you do not know how powerful he is." The sheer depth of his financial abuse washed over me. It was not just a slap to the face. Desmond had systematically stripped a hardworking nurse of her entire life, savings, her independence, and her dignity, so she would be completely trapped in this mansion. He had isolated her and starved her of resources, so she would have no choice but to endure his violence. I looked back at Desmond. He was smirking, leaning against the expensive mahogany banister with a look of absolute triumph. He thought he had won. He thought his financial leverage was an impenetrable shield. He thought I was just a poor, desperate girl who could not possibly afford to support her mother or fight his high-priced legal team. He had absolutely no idea that my personal net worth could buy his failing logistics company 10 times over before my morning coffee. He had no idea that the phone in my hand was connected to accounts holding hundreds of millions of dollars. I let him keep his illusion. I let him soak in his fake victory because the higher his ego soared, the more devastating his inevitable destruction would be. "Keep your trash," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. I wrapped my arms securely around my mother's, trembling shoulders supporting her weight, as we turned away from him. "I am taking my mother." "You walk out that door, Loretta, and you are never coming back," he shouted after us, his voice echoing maliciously. "You will be begging on the streets by next week. Neither of you have the money to survive without me." I ignored him, pulling my mother through the heavy front doors and out into the warm afternoon air. Her tears soaked through the shoulder of my blazer, but I just held her tighter, guiding her down the brick steps toward my unassuming silver sedan. I promised myself right then that Desmond would pay for every single tear she was shedding. We were halfway down the driveway when the loud, obnoxious roar of a high-performance engine shattered the quiet neighborhood. A brand-new bright red Porsche swerved sharply off the main road and aggressively turned into the driveway. The driver purposefully accelerated and then slammed on the brakes, angling the expensive sports car to completely block my modest sedan from pulling out. The passenger door swung open first, and Lauren stepped out onto the pristine driveway. She was 28, white, and dressed head to toe in luxury designer brands that were undoubtedly paid for by the company her husband was running into the ground. Trey stepped out of the driver's side moments later, tossing his sunglasses onto the dashboard with a practiced look of arrogant entitlement. They stood between us and the exit, the final barrier in this toxic household. The bright red Porsche idled aggressively, blocking the only exit from the circular driveway of the sprawling estate. Through my windshield, I watched Lauren step out of the passenger side. She was wearing a silk designer blouse and carrying a leather handbag that cost more than my mother made in an entire month during her nursing days. Lauren was 28, white, and completely oblivious to the reality of the family she had married into. She had latched on to my stepbrother Trey because of his father's perceived wealth, and she wore that false status like a heavy gold crown. Trey stayed leaning against the sports car, looking down at his phone, completely useless as usual, while his wife marched toward my beat-up silver sedan with purposeful, angry strides. My mother shrank down in the passenger seat beside me, trembling as Lauren approached our car. I kept my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, feeling the cold, hard plastic beneath my palms. Lauren marched right up to my window and rapped her perfectly manicured knuckles against the glass. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure condescension and misplaced authority. I rolled the window down just a couple of inches, letting the warm afternoon air slip into the car. Lauren immediately shoved her face near the gap, speaking in that high-pitched, preachy tone she always reserved for me. She told me I was tearing the family apart. She said I was acting like a hysterical child, and that I had absolutely no right to barge into Desmond's house and upset the peace of their afternoon. I let her talk, watching the expensive diamond earrings flash in the sunlight as she shook her head at me. She leaned in closer and lowered her voice to a vicious, spiteful whisper, telling me that a failed single woman like me could not possibly understand the immense stress a successful man like Desmond was under. She said Desmond carried the weight of a massive logistics empire on his shoulders, providing for all of us, and that my mother should be grateful to live in a mansion instead of throwing a tantrum over a little disagreement. The sheer audacity of this woman lecturing me about business stress while her husband was currently bankrupting that very company to fund her shopping sprees was almost comical. She told me to leave my mother in the house and drive back to whatever sad little apartment I rented. She said I was an embarrassment to the family name, and that I needed to finally learn my place. I did not engage in a screaming match. I did not explain to her that the man she was defending was a violent abuser who controlled his wife with fear. I did not bother telling her that the family name she was so proud to marry into was heavily leveraged and sinking fast toward total ruin. I just looked at her directly in the eyes and offered a chilling, serene smile. The kind of smile that promised absolute destruction without uttering a single syllable. Lauren paused mid-sentence, clearly unnerved by my complete lack of emotion. She expected me to cry or yell or beg her to move the car out of the way. Instead, I simply turned my head forward and slammed the heel of my hand onto the center of my steering wheel. The car horn blared loud and piercing, cutting through the quiet suburban neighborhood like a warning siren. Lauren jumped back with a startled shriek, stumbling awkwardly in her designer high heels and dropping her expensive sunglasses onto the concrete driveway. I did not wait for her to recover or for Trey to figure out how to move the Porsche. I shifted the sedan into drive, cut the steering wheel sharply to the right, and hit the gas pedal hard. My tires tore deep, muddy trenches through Desmond's pristine award-winning manicured lawn. Grass and wet dirt sprayed high into the air, covering the side of their shiny sports car, as I swerved completely around them, destroying the landscaping and speeding out the open gate, leaving them choking on exhaust fumes. The drive to the private medical facility took less than 30 minutes, but the silence inside the car made it feel like hours. I bypassed the crowded public emergency rooms and took my mother directly to an exclusive private clinic on the edge of the city, where the staff asked no questions and demanded no insurance forms. I paid the steep admission fee in cash to maintain my anonymity and sat in the sterile waiting room while a team of top-tier doctors examined her thoroughly. When the lead emergency room physician finally emerged, his face was incredibly grim. He called me into a private consulting room and closed the heavy wooden door behind us. He told me that my mother was stable and her facial bruising would heal with time, but that was not his primary medical concern. He looked down at his chart and explained that Loretta was suffering from severe clinical malnutrition. Her blood work showed dangerous vitamin deficiencies and a critically low resting heart rate that could have led to a heart attack. He asked me gently if my mother had reliable access to food or if she was suffering from some sort of psychological eating disorder. I walked into my mother's recovery suite feeling a deep, sickening dread in the pit of my stomach. She was lying in a hospital bed looking so small and fragile under the crisp white blankets. The vibrant woman who had raised me was completely gone, replaced by a terrified shadow. I sat in the chair beside her and took her cold hand in mine. I asked her how long she had been going without regular meals. She refused to meet my eyes, staring blankly at the blank wall ahead. Finally, her voice cracked as she confessed the brutal truth. Desmond had frozen all of her credit cards 3 entire months ago. He had locked her out of the household grocery accounts and instructed the private kitchen staff not to prepare meals for her unless she properly submitted to his daily demands. He had been systematically starving her into compliance right under the nose of his wealthy friends and his obnoxious daughter-in-law. My mother wept quietly, saying she was too ashamed to tell anyone that she was living in a multi-million-dollar mansion, but could not even afford to buy a simple loaf of bread. A dark, heavy silence fell over the hospital room, broken only by the steady beeping of the heart monitor. The protective anger I felt earlier transformed into a terrifying, absolute focus. I let go of her hand and stood up, walking over to the large window that overlooked the sprawling city skyline below. The time for hiding in the shadows was officially over. Desmond thought financial control was his ultimate weapon. He thought money gave him the divine right to act like a god and treat my mother like a prisoner in her own home. I pulled my phone from my pocket and bypassed all my personal applications. My fingers moved rapidly across the smooth glass screen until I opened the highly encrypted internal banking application for Vanguard acquisitions. My eyes darkened as I stared at the glowing dashboard displaying the billions of dollars in liquid capital under my direct and immediate command. Desmond wanted to play a ruthless game of financial warfare against defenseless women, and I was about to show him exactly what a real corporate massacre looked like. I stared at the glowing numbers on my phone screen, feeling the cold, sterile air of the hospital corridor wash over me. Millions of dollars sat in liquid corporate accounts waiting for my command. I bypassed my personal checking and tapped directly into a specialized Vanguard discretionary fund. Within 3 minutes, I wired a massive cash retainer to a premier private security firm based out of Atlanta. I typed out explicit instructions under my corporate alias. I wanted 2 elite guards positioned outside my mother's hospital room 24 hours a day. I wanted a private medical transport vehicle ready the exact moment she was cleared for discharge. Next, I transferred an exorbitant sum directly to the hospital administrator, covering a luxury recovery suite for the next month in full. I made absolutely sure her admission file was sealed under a strict non-disclosure agreement. Desmond thought he could starve her into submission by cutting off her access to $50 for groceries. He thought freezing her debit cards would force her to beg him for basic human necessities. He was about to find out what happened when someone with bottomless financial resources decided to fight back. I walked quietly back into my mother's room. She was fast asleep with a vital nutrient IV hooked into her frail arm. Her cheek was swollen and dark purple from where he had struck her, but her breathing was finally steady. The rhythmic sound of the heart monitor was the only noise in the room until my phone began vibrating violently in my pocket. It was a relentless barrage of text messages from Desmond. I swiped the screen open and read the vitriol pouring in. He demanded to know exactly where I took his wife. He typed that if I did not bring her back to his house immediately, he was going to file a massive lawsuit against both of us. He claimed he would drag my mother through a grueling legal battle and strip her of her legal rights to their joint property. His words were dripping with the toxic patriarchy he used to rule our family. He said he would leave her completely bankrupt and force her to crawl back to him on her hands and knees just to survive. The final text made my jaw clench so hard my teeth ached. He typed my lawyer bills $800 an hour. "So can you even afford a bus pass, little girl?" He told me I was playing a game with adults and I was going to lose everything. I stared at his arrogant words, reading them over and over again. He was so incredibly confident in his perceived power. He had spent the last 15 years using his regional logistics company as a heavy weapon to dominate everyone around him. He built his entire identity on the illusion that he was untouchable, simply because he wore expensive custom suits and threw money at country club charity events to impress other rich men. He truly believed I was just a struggling artist scraping by on minimum wage living in a rundown apartment. He had no idea that while he was taking out high-interest business loans to buy his lazy son a Porsche, I was actively buying the debt of supply chain companies twice his size. He had no idea that my decoy life was specifically designed to protect my assets from greedy parasites exactly like him. My mother shifted in her sleep, letting out a soft whimper of pain. I looked at her bruised face and felt a terrifying coldness settle over my heart. Desmond had always controlled us with money. He used his bank accounts as a leash, yanking us back whenever we dared to step out of line. He thought money was his ultimate shield. So I decided I was going to take his shield and crush him with it. I was going to dismantle his fake empire brick by brick until he had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. I wanted him to feel the exact same helpless panic my mother felt when she swiped her card at the pharmacy and it was inexplicably declined. I did not reply to his pathetic threats. Typing back would only validate his bloated ego and let him think he still had a grip on my emotions. Instead, I turned my phone off silent mode and walked back out into the quiet hospital corridor. I paced down the hall until I found an empty waiting area and dialed a number that bypassed all standard reception desks. The call went straight to a highly secure line in downtown Manhattan. My executive assistant answered on the second ring with crisp professionalism. I kept my voice low and completely devoid of emotion. I told him to access the Vanguard intelligence database immediately. I gave him the exact corporate name and tax identification number for Desmond's logistics firm. I told him I needed a comprehensive and brutal breakdown of his entire corporate debt profile. I wanted to know about every single outstanding loan, every overdrawn line of credit, and every hidden financial liability he possessed. I wanted to know exactly who he owed money to and when those payments were due. My assistant confirmed the request without missing a beat, typing rapidly on his keyboard. He asked what the primary objective was for this sudden audit. I looked back through the glass window of the hospital room, watching my mother finally rest in a place where Desmond could not reach her. I gripped my phone tight and delivered the final instruction that would trigger the collapse of his life. I told my assistant to contact our elite partners at the commercial bank holding Desmond's primary business accounts. I told him I wanted the bank to call in all of his commercial business loans in full by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the massive corner office at Desmond Logistics. The room was a monument to unearned arrogance filled with dark mahogany furniture, expensive leather couches, and golf trophies polished to a blinding shine. Desmond sat behind his expansive desk, sipping a premium scotch despite it being barely 10 in the morning, while his son Trey lounged on the sofa, browsing luxury watch catalogs on his tablet. They were busy congratulating themselves on their own brilliance, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine hanging directly over their heads. Their self-congratulatory laughter was abruptly cut short when the heavy glass door of the office swung open. A breathless executive assistant stepped inside, followed closely by a stern-looking courier wearing a crisp gray uniform. The courier did not offer a polite greeting. He simply marched across the plush carpet and dropped a thick, sealed legal envelope directly onto the center of Desmond's pristine desk. He demanded a signature and walked out, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in his wake. Desmond snatched the envelope with an annoyed scoff, muttering about the incompetence of banks these days. He ripped the seal open and pulled out a stack of dense legal documents bearing the crest of their primary commercial lender. Trey watched his father with mild amusement, expecting it to be just another routine contract or a minor compliance update. But as Desmond read the first paragraph, the color violently drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His hand began to tremble so violently that the expensive paper rattled against the silent air of the room. "What is it?" Dad Trey asked, sitting up slightly and setting his tablet down on the glass coffee table. Desmond could barely form the words. His jaw worked silently for a few seconds before he finally choked out the truth. "The bank just froze every single one of our corporate credit lines. They are halting all outgoing wire transfers effective immediately. They are citing severe financial irregularities and demanding a full independent audit of our operating accounts by the end of the week." The moment the words financial irregularities hit the air, all the blood rushed out of Trey's face. His stomach dropped into a bottomless pit of sheer terror, and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. Trey knew exactly what those irregularities were, because he was the one who created them. For the past 2 years, he had been quietly and systematically siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from the company payroll and equipment funds. He needed the cash to maintain the absurdly lavish lifestyle his wife Lauren demanded. Those designer handbags, the luxury cars, the extravagant vacations, they were all funded by stolen corporate money. Worse than that, Trey had a severe underground gambling addiction that he had been desperately trying to hide from his father. He had been moving company funds through fake vendor invoices to cover massive losses at high-stakes poker games, hoping to win it back before anyone noticed the missing capital. Now the bank was looking right at the massive gaping hole he had dug. Trey braced himself for his father's wrath, expecting Desmond to demand access to the accounting software right then and there. But Desmond did not look at his son. Operating on a foundation of deeply toxic and patriarchal logic, Desmond paced the length of his massive office, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He did not suspect his golden boy of embezzlement. Instead, his twisted mind searched for a target that fit his worldview. "It is that worthless stepdaughter of mine!" Desmond roared, slamming his fist down on the mahogany desk so hard the Scotch glass tipped over and spilled amber liquid across the polished wood. "This is all her fault." Trey blinked in stunned silence, wiping the sweat from his upper lip. "What does Nadia have to do with our commercial credit lines?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly with nervous relief. Desmond shot him a look of absolute disgust, as if Trey was entirely blind to the realities of high-level business. "These banking executives talk Trey. They play golf at my club. They gossip with their wives. Nadia dragged your mother out of my house like a common criminal yesterday, and the rumors are already spreading. A man whose wife walks out on him looks unstable. He looks like a high-risk investment. The bank must have heard that my household is falling apart and they panicked. They think my assets are going to be tied up in a messy divorce, so they pulled our funding to protect themselves. That miserable broke little graphic designer intentionally ruined my flawless family image. And now she is costing me my business." Trey nodded eagerly, absolutely willing to let Nadia take the blame for his own criminal actions. "You are right, Dad," he agreed, standing up and pacing alongside his father. "She caused this whole mess. But what are we going to do? We have a massive payroll due on Friday, and a fleet of trucks that need fuel. If the credit lines are frozen, we cannot operate for more than 48 hours without defaulting." Desmond ran a shaking hand over his graying hair, his mind racing for a solution that would save his precious ego. He refused to let his wealthy peers see him fail. He needed a massive injection of untraceable capital, and he needed it immediately, before the bank auditors could look closely enough to discover whatever discrepancies triggered the freeze in the first place. "There is a private equity firm I keep hearing about at the country club," Desmond said, his eyes narrowing with desperate calculation. "A massive, ruthless corporate entity that specializes in rapid, aggressive bailouts and emergency acquisitions. They have bottomless pockets and they close deals in days, not months." Trey looked at his father, a glimmer of hope piercing through his blind panic. "What are they called?" "Vanguard Acquisitions," Desmond replied, marching back to his desk and hitting the intercom button to summon his terrified secretary. "Get me the corporate office of Vanguard Acquisitions on the line right this second," he barked into the speaker. "Tell them Desmond Logistics is offering an exclusive emergency buyout opportunity, and I demand to speak directly with their chief executive officer." Desmond stood tall, adjusting his tie, preparing to use every ounce of his charm and intimidation to secure a financial lifeline from the leader of Vanguard. He stood in his crumbling office, overflowing with toxic pride, completely and utterly unaware that the powerful, mysterious CEO he was about to beg for mercy was the exact same woman he had just threatened to leave begging on the streets. "After ensuring my mother was safely hidden away in an exclusive private medical facility surrounded by elite security guards, I drove my beat-up silver sedan back into the city. I needed to visit my decoy apartment to retrieve some highly sensitive documents. I had rented this dilapidated unit on the south side of town years ago for a few $100s a month, specifically to maintain the illusion of my poverty. The peeling yellow paint on the walls and the permanently stained linoleum floors were the perfect camouflage against Desmond and his spies. They needed to believe I was a miserable, struggling clerk, and this miserable space was my stage. The heavy thud of the rusted metal door echoed through the cramped living room as I locked myself inside. I had barely been inside for 10 minutes when the sudden sharp sound of expensive stiletto heels clicking aggressively against the cheap concrete walkway outside broke the silence. A moment later, someone pounded on my front door with furious entitlement. I did not need to check the peephole to know who had managed to track down my fake address. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, revealing Lauren standing in the gloomy hallway. She was wearing a pristine white designer coat, holding a luxury handbag tightly against her chest, as if she was afraid the very air in my hallway might infect her with poverty. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure disgust, as her eyes darted around the dingy entryway, taking in the water stains on the ceiling and the flickering fluorescent bulb overhead. She pushed past me without an invitation, stepping into the center of my small living room. She looked at my cheap thrift store furniture and let out a dramatic sigh of absolute revulsion. "You actually live in this disgusting place?" she sneered, running a manicured finger over the dusty edge of a plastic table. "I always knew you were a pathetic failure, Nadia, but this is truly a new low even for you." I closed the door quietly and leaned against it. "What do you want, Lauren?" I asked, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. She turned to face me, her eyes flashing with toxic arrogance. She reached into her $1,000 handbag and pulled out a small wad of crisp bills. With a theatrical gesture of supreme condescension, she tossed the money onto my cheap kitchen table. 5 crisp $100 bills fluttered down and settled against the worn surface. "Take this and feed your mother," Lauren demanded, her voice echoing with the toxic family values she had absorbed from her father-in-law. "Tell her to go home and apologize to Desmond. Trey and Desmond are about to close a multi-million-dollar buyout with Vanguard, and your poverty is embarrassing our reputation. A failed single woman like you could not possibly understand the stress a successful man like Desmond is under." I stared at the $500 on the table and then looked back at her. Her sheer ignorance was almost breathtaking. She was completely unaware that her husband Trey was embezzling company funds to pay for the exact coat she was wearing. She was entirely blind to the fact that their entire empire was crumbling to dust. "You see?" Lauren continued, pacing across the small room as if she was delivering a highly important corporate lecture. "Desmond and Trey are currently orchestrating the biggest business move of their careers. They are securing emergency capital from a massive private equity firm. It is a highly exclusive deal, and your little stunt yesterday is causing unnecessary distractions. Vanguard is a cutthroat firm, and Desmond cannot afford to look weak in front of their executives. So you are going to take that money, buy your mother a decent meal, and send her back where she belongs before you ruin everything." I listened to her brag about Vanguard Acquisitions, the very company I had built from the ground up, the company where I sat as the chief executive officer. The irony was so thick and delicious I could practically taste it. She was standing in my fake apartment throwing $500 at a billionaire and lecturing me about my own private equity firm. I did not scream at her. I did not laugh in her face or explain the terrifying reality of her situation. My years of corporate warfare had taught me that the most devastating weapon is total silence. I simply walked over to the cheap kitchen table and picked up the $500. I folded the bills neatly and slid them into the pocket of my simple, unbranded cardigan. "Thank you," I said, offering her a chilling, serene smile. "I will put this toward a charity," Lauren scoffed, rolling her eyes in absolute disgust. "Just fix this mess, Nadia," she snapped, turning on her heel and marching back toward the front door. "Do not make Desmond destroy you because he will not hesitate." She ripped the door open and stormed out into the gloomy hallway, her expensive heels clicking rapidly as she hurried to escape the stench of my decoy life. I watched her go, my serene smile slowly fading into a look of absolute cold calculation. I locked the deadbolt behind her and listened until the sound of her footsteps faded completely into the distance. The moment she was gone, I turned away from the door and walked into the small kitchen area. I reached under the loose floorboard beneath the sink and pulled out a heavy fireproof safe. I entered the biometric code, and the heavy steel door clicked open. Inside sat a sleek black leather portfolio stamped with the silver crest of Vanguard Acquisitions. I pulled the portfolio out and laid it flat across the cheap Formica counter. I opened the leather cover, revealing a stack of dense, highly confidential corporate contracts. It was the official authorization request Desmond had frantically submitted to my firm just hours ago. His financial team was begging for a rapid cash injection to save their logistics company from total collapse. I pulled a heavy gold fountain pen from the spine of the portfolio and flipped to the final signature page. Desmond thought he was securing a standard corporate loan to save his ego. He had absolutely no idea that the silent, invisible executives at Vanguard had just finished restructuring his entire agreement. I read over the new terms carefully. The stipulations were beautifully predatory. The moment Desmond signed this contract, he would inadvertently trigger a cascade of hidden clauses that would legally strip him of all his equity. The loans were designed to default immediately upon the discovery of any internal financial irregularities which I already knew Trey was committing. Desmond was signing away his life. With a slow, deliberate motion, I pressed the tip of my gold pen against the thick parchment paper. I signed my name across the official Vanguard authorization to begin negotiations with Desmond's company, incorporating the hidden clauses designed to legally strip him of all equity. I set the pen down and closed the leather portfolio, the heavy thud sounding like a coffin slamming shut on his entire miserable existence. The heavy thud of the leather portfolio closing felt like a heartbeat. I left my rundown decoy apartment behind and drove straight back to the private medical facility. My mother was sitting up in her plush hospital bed, the afternoon sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her luxury recovery suite. The color was slowly returning to her hollow cheeks, and the intravenous nutrients had worked absolute miracles on her fragile frame. She looked at me with clear eyes, but a deep, lingering shame still shadowed her expression. I sat on the edge of the mattress and brushed a stray lock of hair from her bruised forehead. She took a deep, shaky breath and told me she had something else to confess, something far worse than the frozen credit cards. Her voice dropped to a terrified whisper as she explained how Desmond had orchestrated the theft of our ancestral family land. 2 years ago, when she was heavily medicated, recovering from a minor surgery, Desmond had brought a stack of dense papers to her bedside, claiming they were routine medical insurance documents. He had guided her groggy hand to sign the bottom line, while she could barely keep her eyes open. It was only months later she realized she had actually signed over the deed to the 50 acres of pristine lakefront property her grandfather had left her. Desmond had transferred the entire estate directly into Trey's name, so the boy could use the land as collateral to fund his endless gambling debts and luxury car leases. My blood turned to absolute ice, but I kept my face entirely calm for her sake. I promised her right then and there that we would get every single grain of dirt back. While my mother rested in absolute safety, I unleashed the full terrifying power of Vanguard Acquisitions. Early the next morning, a fleet of sleek black SUVs pulled up to the front entrance of Desmond's logistics firm. My elite team of forensic accountants and senior corporate auditors marched through the double-glass doors carrying locked briefcases and a mandate of absolute authority. Desmond greeted them with a sickeningly arrogant smile, shaking their hands and offering them premium coffee, completely unaware that he was welcoming his own executioners into his fortress. He handed over total access to his internal servers, his payroll accounts, and his deeply flawed ledger books, believing that Vanguard was just doing routine due diligence before handing him a massive bailout check. He told his terrified staff to cooperate fully, bragging loudly that this buyout would make them all richer and more powerful than ever. It took my team exactly 48 hours to rip the floorboards out of his fake empire. I sat in my high-tech command center across the city, watching the data stream across my encrypted monitors in real time. Trey was not just a lazy, entitled brat, he was a catastrophically stupid criminal. The audit team effortlessly uncovered the massive web of fake vendor invoices and phantom shell companies Trey had created to siphon money directly into his personal accounts. They traced hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing out of the company payroll to fund Lauren's designer wardrobes and Trey's massive underground poker losses. But the forensic accountants found something even more devastating. In his desperate attempt to cover his tracks and keep the company cash flow appearing normal to his father, Trey had completely falsified the company's state tax returns for 3 consecutive years. He had committed massive federal and state tax fraud, leaving a glaring, undeniable paper trail that linked directly back to his own personal signature. Desmond was entirely blind to the rot eating his company from the inside out. But now, the full extent of their criminal incompetence was perfectly documented in a 50-page Vanguard audit report. My lead corporate counsel. A sharp, ruthless man named Marcus walked into my office and placed the final physical copy of the audit report on my glass desk. The evidence was completely bulletproof. Marcus tapped the heavy file and looked at me with cold professional efficiency. He told me this was textbook felony embezzlement and massive tax evasion. He asked if I wanted him to forward the entire dossier directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and have the authorities arrest Trey and Desmond quietly by the end of the week. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the damning documents that held the power to destroy the men who had tortured my mother for years. I slowly shook my head. Sending them quietly to a federal prison in handcuffs was far too merciful, and it would allow Desmond to play the victim of a rogue son. They had spent their entire lives worshipping social status, country club memberships, and public perception. They derived their power from making people like me and my mother feel incredibly small and worthless in front of an audience. I looked up at Marcus and told him to hold the FBI tip. I did not want them quietly arrested in the middle of the night where no one could see their humiliation. I wanted to wait until the highly publicized annual country club gala this coming weekend. I wanted to publicly execute their toxic pride in front of the very society they worshipped and force them to watch their empire burn to ash in front of everyone they desperately wanted to impress. I returned to my decoy apartment one last time to collect the remaining surveillance equipment I had hidden in the walls. The heavy wooden door creaked open, revealing a thick cream-colored envelope resting on the cheap welcome mat. It had been shoved violently under the doorframe. The envelope was sealed with thick crimson wax and stamped with the golden crest of the most exclusive country club in the state. I broke the wax seal and pulled out a heavy cardstock invitation trimmed in genuine gold foil. The elegant calligraphy announced a massive celebratory gala, hosted by Desmond Logistics. They were celebrating what the card called a historic merger and acquisition deal that would solidify their legacy for generations. A small, heavy piece of personalized stationery fell out from the folds of the invitation and fluttered to the ground. I picked it up and read the sloppy, handwritten scrawl across the front. It was from Desmond. He had taken the time out of his allegedly busy schedule to write a personal taunt. The note told me to come to the club and see how real men make millions. He wrote that if I dressed nicely and stood quietly in the corner, maybe the Vanguard CEO would pity me enough to offer me a janitor job at their new corporate headquarters. I stared at the note, feeling a cold smile stretch across my face. The sheer magnitude of their delusion was almost beautiful. My elite audit team had spent the last 48 hours tearing their financial records to shreds and sending the damning reports directly to my secure server. Yet Desmond and Trey were entirely convinced that Vanguard was simply performing routine paperwork before handing them a massive bailout check. Trey had likely convinced himself that the Vanguard auditors were too stupid to notice the millions he had embezzled to pay for his gambling debts. He probably thought the buyout would magically erase his criminal trail and give him a fresh slate to start stealing all over again. Lauren was undoubtedly at some high-end boutique right now, swiping a company credit card that was about to be declined, trying to find a dress that would make her the center of attention. Desmond, on the other hand, was operating on pure toxic ego. He had rented out the entire grand ballroom of the country club, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars. He did not actually have just to throw a party for himself. He wanted to stand on a stage in front of the city's elite and brag about how he had outsmarted a brutal private equity firm. He wanted to parade his fake success in front of the very society he worshipped, while his wife recovered from malnutrition in a hidden hospital room. The country club had always been his ultimate weapon of social destruction. He used to force my mother to attend these exact same galas, wearing outdated clothes, just so his wealthy friends could quietly mock her. He loved making her feel small in rooms full of crystal chandeliers and imported champagne. He invited me tonight because he needed a scapegoat. He needed the audience to see the pathetic stepdaughter shrinking in the shadows to make his fake triumph seem even brighter. I left the miserable apartment, leaving the door wide open behind me. I drove straight back to the private medical clinic as the sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the pristine hospital grounds. I walked into my mother's recovery suite and found her sitting by the large glass window. The swelling on her face had gone down significantly, and the elite medical care had restored a healthy glow to her skin. She was reading a book, but looked up when I entered the room. I dropped the gold-foiled invitation onto her bedside table. She picked it up and read the cruel handwritten note from her abusive husband. Her hands trembled slightly, but there was a new strength in her eyes. She looked at me and asked if Desmond actually secured the buyout he was bragging about. I sat on the edge of her bed and told her the absolute truth. I told her that Desmond had indeed signed the Vanguard authorization papers, but he failed to read the invisible ink. I explained that he had gleefully signed a document that bound him to predatory hidden clauses, completely stripping him of all his equity the moment his son's embezzlement was legally verified. I told her that the ink was already dry and the trap was already sprung. Desmond was currently hosting a victory party for a company he no longer owned, using money he no longer had to impress people who were about to watch him lose everything. I walked over to the heavy mahogany closet in the corner of the luxury suite. My assistant had delivered a garment bag earlier that afternoon, precisely per my instructions. I unzipped the black canvas, revealing a breathtaking razor-sharp designer silk gown. It was a deep midnight blue that shimmered like liquid glass under the hospital lights. The cut was ruthless and elegant, projecting an aura of absolute power and untouchable wealth. It was the exact kind of dress Desmond always told my mother she was too old and too plain to wear. It was the kind of dress Lauren would max out 3 stolen credit cards to afford only to look like a cheap imitation. I slipped into the adjoining dressing room and changed. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, aggressive style and applied a dark crimson lipstick. When I stepped back out into the soft light of the recovery suite, my mother gasped softly. The struggling artist who wore baggy sweaters and cheap jeans was completely gone. The woman standing in the room was the apex predator of the corporate financial world. My mother looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and lingering maternal fear. She looked at the heavy gold invitation still resting on her tray table, and then back at my designer gown. Her voice wavered slightly as she asked me if I was really going to walk into that country club full of arrogant rich men, just to let them humiliate me one last time. I adjusted the heavy diamond watch on my wrist, feeling the cold metal press against my skin. I looked directly into her eyes with terrifying serenity. I told her, "No, Mom. I am not going there to be humiliated. I'm going there to close a deal." The tires of our hired black town car crunched against the pristine white gravel of the Oak Ridge Country Club driveway. I stepped out into the crisp evening air, offering my hand to help my mother from the back seat. The grand ballroom loomed before us, a grotesque monument to old money and carefully guarded secrets. Massive crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across the manicured lawns, and the faint sound of a classical string quartet drifted through the heavy mahogany doors. My mother hesitated, her grip tightening on my arm, as we walked up the sweeping marble steps, but I kept my posture perfectly rigid. The midnight blue silk of my gown whispered against the stone, a dark warning that no one inside was prepared to hear. We handed our coats to a bewildered attendant and stepped into the main hall. It was a sea of bespoke tuxedos and blinding diamond necklaces. Right in the dead center of the room, holding court beneath the largest chandelier, stood Desmond Trey and Lauren. They were surrounded by the city's financial elite, laughing loudly and clinking crystal flutes of imported champagne. Desmond was practically vibrating with bloated pride, playing the role of the conquering business titan. He was bragging loudly to a group of regional bankers about how his unparalleled logistics network had attracted the attention of a global equity giant. Trey stood beside him, looking slightly pale and sweating through his custom collar. He was downing his drink far too quickly, still terrified of the bank freeze and the missing funds, but desperately pretending everything was fine. He truly believed this buyout would magically erase his massive embezzlement trail. Lauren spotted me first. Her eyes locked onto the razor-sharp cut of my designer gown, and I watched a flash of pure envious panic ripple across her perfectly contoured face. Her own dress, a loud, gaudy, sequined disaster paid for with Trey's stolen corporate funds, suddenly looked incredibly cheap by comparison. Her insecurity instantly morphed into vicious hostility as she realized I was not wearing thrift store rags. She turned to the tight circle of wealthy wives surrounding her, making sure her voice was loud enough to carry over the gentle hum of the string quartet. "Look who actually showed up," Lauren sneered, pointing her half-empty champagne flute directly at me. "It is my freeloading blue-collar stepsister. I cannot believe security even let her through the front gate." She leaned in, conspiring with the other women, but projecting her words like a stage actor. She told the gaping wives that I was a struggling graphic designer who lived in a rat-infested apartment and that I had only come tonight to beg for table scraps. She laughed a high-pitched grating sound, claiming I was probably hoping to steal a few hors d'oeuvres to take back to my miserable little life, so my mother would not starve. "Your poverty is embarrassing our reputation," Lauren added, spitting the words like venom. The other women tittered uncomfortably, eyeing me with a mixture of pity and overt disdain. I did not break my stride. I did not lower my gaze or offer a defensive reply. I simply walked past her circle of sycophants, letting the heavy silence stretch until Lauren's fake laughter died completely in her throat. My absolute lack of reaction unsettled her deeply, leaving her standing there holding her drink, looking utterly foolish and ignored. Desmond finally noticed our arrival, and his face immediately darkened with toxic rage. He broke away from his group of admiring investors and marched directly toward us, his heavy footsteps echoing his intent. He did not even look at me. His predatory focus was entirely fixed on my mother. He grabbed her roughly by the elbow and yanked her away from my side, dragging her toward the towering champagne pyramid set up near the back wall. I followed closely behind my face, a mask of serene calculation as I listened to him hiss his demands. He backed her into the corner, his teeth bared in a vicious smile meant to look like an affectionate whisper to anyone watching from a distance. "You are going to stand by my side, and you are going to smile for the cameras." Desmond threatened, his grip tightening painfully on her fragile arm. "The executives from Vanguard are arriving any minute to finalize our buyout, and I need them to see a happy, stable family man." He leaned closer, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and cheap desperation. "If you pull one of your pathetic emotional stunts tonight and ruin my image in front of these billionaires, I swear to God, I will leave you on the streets with absolutely nothing. I will bury you in legal fees until you are begging for mercy. You will play the perfect devoted wife tonight, or you will face the consequences." My mother looked up at him, her breathing shallow, but instead of shrinking away, she glanced over at my face. She saw the cold, absolute certainty in my eyes, the knowledge of the trap that was already snapping shut around his throat. And for the first time in 15 years, she did not apologize to him. She simply pulled her arm out of his grasp with quiet dignity and smoothed the fabric of her dress, leaving Desmond staring at her in momentary shock. Before he could snap at her again, the music abruptly stopped. A heavy, expectant silence fell over the massive ballroom as conversations died mid-sentence. The silver-haired maitre d' stepped up to the brass microphone at the front of the grand stage, his voice echoing clearly across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "the representatives from Vanguard Acquisitions have officially arrived." A collective murmur of excitement swept through the crowd. Desmond's eyes widened with greedy anticipation. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he would save his crumbling empire and solidify his legacy as an untouchable titan of industry. He needed to be front and center to greet the mysterious corporate saviors who were supposedly bringing his bailout money. He spun around violently, eager to push his way to the front of the crowd. In his frantic rush, he slammed his shoulder hard into my chest, nearly knocking me off balance. "Get out of the way, useless!" Desmond snarled, shoving me aside without a second glance. "Let the adults handle the real business." He smoothed his tuxedo jacket and marched eagerly toward the heavy double mahogany doors, completely unaware that the executioner he was so desperate to meet was already standing right behind him. The mahogany doors swung open with a synchronized force that silenced the entire room. 3 men stepped into the ballroom, instantly drawing every eye toward them. They were dressed in charcoal suits that cost more than my first car, their movements precise and intimidating. They moved with the heavy-weighted confidence of men who decided the fates of multinational corporations before breakfast. Desmond and Trey saw the opportunity of a lifetime. Their faces flushed with a pathetic mixture of greed and relief as they abandoned their half-finished drinks and rushed across the polished floor. Desmond reached them first, his smile wide and desperate, his hands outstretched in a frantic display of supplication. He was already rehearsing his victory speech, his eyes darting toward the crowd to ensure his peers witnessed his moment of greatness. Trey followed closely behind his posture, hunched and jittery, clearly hoping the legal team would simply hand over the check and disappear before anyone asked about the missing payroll millions. They began to fawn and grovel immediately, their voices raised in nauseatingly performative praise for the firm that was supposedly saving them. The lead lawyer, a man with silver hair and eyes that looked like frozen steel, ignored their outstretched hands completely. He surveyed the opulent room with a look of profound disdain, as if he were inspecting a trash heap rather than a gathering of the city's elite. Desmond, sensing the tension, laughed nervously and gestured toward the stage where he planned to make his big announcement. He looked behind the lawyers, waiting for the shadow of their employer to appear. "Where is your CEO?" he asked, his voice booming across the silent ballroom. I have been dying to meet the visionary who finally recognized the potential of Desmond Logistics. Who is the genius who agreed to our $10 million buyout? The lead lawyer did not blink. His expression remained frozen in an icy mask of corporate perfection. He adjusted his silk tie and looked directly at Desmond with a gaze that made the older man falter. "Our CEO has been here the entire evening," he replied, his voice low and devoid of emotion. The room erupted into confused murmurs. Desmond and Trey spun around, scanning the room for a mysterious, high-powered executive they had never met. They looked at the various tables of wealthy investors and socialites waiting for someone to stand up and claim the title. Trey wiped his sweating palms on his trousers, his panic spiking as he realized something was fundamentally wrong with their rehearsed plan. The 3 lawyers did not turn to scan the room. They did not look for a powerful man in a dark suit. Instead, they stepped aside in perfect unison, clearing a path through the crowded floor. They walked with unwavering purpose directly toward me. The air in the room felt like it was freezing. I stood perfectly still in my midnight blue gown, the diamonds at my throat catching the light. My mother stood just slightly behind me, her hands clasped tightly together, her gaze fixed on the men approaching us. Desmond caught sight of their destination, and his face contorted in a mix of confusion and building rage. He looked at the lawyers and then back at me, his mind struggling to bridge the impossible gap between the stepdaughter he had spent years tormenting and the corporate powerhouse he was trying to woo. As the lawyers reached us, they stopped and performed a low, synchronized bow that looked entirely out of place in such a gaudy setting. The lead attorney looked at me, his face finally softening into a look of genuine deference. "Boss," he said loudly enough for the surrounding crowd to hear, "the acquisition contracts are ready for your final signature." The ballroom went completely still. Desmond stood frozen, his mouth agape, his world fracturing in real time. Trey looked as if he might actually collapse on the spot. The absolute look of horror on his face was the single most satisfying sight I had ever witnessed. They had spent the entire evening mocking me, calling me a failure, and planning to humiliate me before their peers. They had built this entire gala around the lie of their own brilliance, and now they were forced to watch the truth shatter their reality. I looked at the lead lawyer, and then slowly turned my gaze to Desmond. He was shaking now, his ego finally colliding with the cold, hard facts of his ruin. The silence in the room was so thick I could hear the distant hum of the club air conditioning. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my fountain pen, the gold casing gleaming in the light. Desmond looked at the pen and then at me, and for the first time in his life, he looked absolutely terrified. He realized in that split second that the janitor job he had offered me was not my future, but his own. I did not say a word. I did not have to. The look on my face was a declaration of war, and he was already standing on the losing side. I stepped past him toward the stage where he had intended to celebrate his survival and prepared to show him exactly what it meant to lose everything. The absolute silence in the grand ballroom was suddenly broken by the sharp, piercing sound of shattering crystal. Lauren stood frozen near the towering champagne pyramid, her mouth hanging wide open in pure shock. Her expensive wineglass had slipped from her manicured fingers and exploded across the polished marble floor, sending sharp shards and pale liquid splashing over the hem of her gaudy sequined dress. She did not even blink or reach down to clean the mess. Her eyes were locked entirely on the three elite corporate lawyers who were still bowing respectfully in my direction. The wealthy wives who had just been laughing at me moments ago were now staring at Lauren with deep, uncomfortable confusion and then turning their wide eyes toward me. Desmond's face contorted into a mask of sheer terror and violent denial. The arrogant smirk he had worn all evening melted off his face, leaving behind the pathetic expression of a cornered animal. He stumbled forward, his heavy breathing echoing in the quiet room. "What kind of sick joke is this?" he stammered, his voice cracking in panic as he looked from the lead attorney back to me. "You are a pathetic failure, Nadia. You are a failed graphic designer who lives in a rat-infested dump. You cannot possibly be the buyer. There is no way you are running Vanguard." I did not even bother giving him a direct answer right then. I simply looked at him with a chilling, serene smile and walked gracefully toward the velvet-lined steps of the main stage. My midnight blue silk gown trailed behind me like a dark shadow, projecting an aura of absolute untouchable power. The crowd parted for me immediately, the regional bankers and elite socialites stepping aside in total stunned silence. I walked directly up to the brass microphone stand that Desmond had proudly set up for his own victory speech. I adjusted the height with slow, deliberate precision, taking a moment to look out over the sea of faces. My mother stood near the back, her posture perfectly straight, watching her abusive husband slowly realize his life was over. My posture was terrifyingly commanding as I leaned into the microphone. My voice echoed crystal clear and completely steady across the vast ballroom. "I was never a graphic designer." "Desmond," I said calmly, the words slicing through the heavy air. "That was a carefully constructed decoy title, so you and your greedy son could not drain my bank accounts the exact same way you drained my mother's. I built a decoy life and rented a miserable apartment just to keep you entirely blind to my actual wealth. I knew that if you thought I was broken and poor, you would never look closely enough to see the empire I was building right under your nose." I paused, letting the devastating reality sink deeply into his thick skull. Desmond was practically vibrating with rage and fear, his hands balling into fists at his sides. But he was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the moment. Trey had already slumped against a cocktail table, looking as if he was going to be physically sick. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Acquisitions," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "And as of 9 o'clock this morning, your entire logistics company officially belongs to me." A collective gasp rippled through the elite crowd. The whispers began immediately as the wealthy guests turned to look at Desmond with sudden glaring suspicion. Desmond shook his head wildly, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson as his ego fought a losing battle against the truth. "That is a lie," he shouted, pointing a trembling, sweaty finger at me from the middle of the dance floor. "This is a merger. Vanguard gave me a $10 million capital injection to expand my operations. My company is stronger than ever. You are just trying to ruin my night because you are jealous." I smiled again, feeling no anger, just the pure, delicious thrill of total victory. I reached into my silk clutch and pulled out a small, black remote control. I told the crowd that I wanted to share the true historic nature of Desmond's business with all his closest friends and investors. I pressed a single button, and the massive high-definition projection screens behind me flared to life, instantly illuminating the entire stage. The screens did not show the glorious merger announcement Desmond had prepared. Instead, they displayed the highly confidential Vanguard audit reports, exposing the terrifying reality of his financial state. I stood back and let the entire country club read the undeniable proof of his destruction. The charts and graphs proved in massive, glowing numbers that Desmond Logistics was entirely bankrupt. The documents revealed he had been living on fraudulent credit lines for years, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of wealth while his company bled dry. The next slide flashed onto the screen, showing the precise forensic accounting of Trey's massive embezzlement. The crowd gasped aloud as they saw the hundreds of thousands of dollars transferred directly from the company payroll into offshore gambling accounts and luxury retail boutiques. I pointed to the screen, noting that Lauren was wearing a coat paid for by phantom shell companies. Lauren let out a sharp cry and covered her face, while the other wives physically backed away from her as if her sudden poverty was a contagious disease. The final slide locked into place, displaying the undeniable evidence of massive federal tax evasion. I spoke into the microphone one last time, telling Desmond that he did not sign a merger agreement today. He signed a predatory loan filled with hidden clauses that legally stripped him of all his equity the moment his son's criminal fraud was verified. I told him he was no longer a business titan. He was just a bankrupt man standing in a rented tuxedo waiting for the federal authorities to arrive. The reality of my words finally shattered the last remaining fragment of Trey's fragile sanity. The illusion he had built of being an untouchable corporate prince completely dissolved, leaving behind nothing but raw panic. He let out a guttural scream that sounded more like a wounded animal than a human being. His face flushed a violent shade of purple as he threw his half-empty champagne glass blindly into the crowd, not caring who it hit or where it landed. He began screaming profanities at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing horribly against the vaulted ceilings and bouncing off the crystal chandeliers of the grand ballroom. He thrashed wildly, knocking over a tall cocktail table and sending a silver tray of delicate hors d'oeuvres crashing to the marble floor in a shower of shattered glass and ruined food. He lunged forward, his fists clenched tightly at his sides, attempting to rush the stage where I stood. He wanted to physically silence the truth. He wanted to tear down the projection screens that were displaying his undeniable crimes to the entire world. He thought violence could save him the way it had always saved his father. But Desmond had hired the absolute best private security for his little vanity gala, wanting to project an image of supreme importance. 4 massive men in dark suits materialized from the shadows of the ballroom, their movements swift and utterly merciless. Before Trey could even reach the first velvet-lined step, they intercepted his pathetic charge. They did not treat him like the son of a wealthy VIP. They treated him like a dangerous, hostile threat. They tackled him hard, driving his face directly into the polished marble floor. The sound of the impact was a sickening thud that made several of the wealthy guests gasp in horror and step backward. The security guards twisted his arms behind his back, violently pinning him down while he continued to thrash and spit, cursing my name and crying like a spoiled child who had finally been told no for the very first time in his miserable life. His expensive tuxedo jacket ripped at the shoulder as they pressed their knees into his spine, holding him completely immobilized against the cold stone. Lauren did not rush forward to help her struggling husband. She did not cry out or demand that the security guards release him. Instead, all the artificial color drained completely from her face, leaving her looking ghostly pale and terrifyingly hollow. She watched the man who funded her lavish lifestyle getting crushed against the floor, and her only instinct was absolute self-preservation. She slowly began backing away, her expensive heels scraping quietly against the floor. She was desperately trying to shrink into the shadows, hoping the crowd would magically forget she was ever associated with the screaming criminal bleeding on the ground. The wealthy wives she had been trying to impress just moments earlier formed a physical wall, turning their backs on her, entirely isolating her in her own private nightmare of impending poverty. Lauren wrapped her arms around herself, realizing that the designer dress she was wearing was probably the last piece of luxury she would ever own. I did not flinch as Trey screamed from the floor. I did not look at Lauren cowering in the dark. My focus remained absolutely fixed on the digital projector and the ruined man standing directly before me. Desmond was hyperventilating, his hands clutching his chest as he stared at the financial ruin displayed on the massive screens. I clicked the small black remote one more time, delivering the final lethal corporate strike. The screen shifted, the bankruptcy charts vanishing and being replaced by a highly detailed web of banking ledgers. The new slide displayed the exact wire transfers, the specific offshore accounts, and the fake vendor invoices Trey had used to launder money out of the company for years. Every single stolen dollar was highlighted in bright, damning crimson for the entire city to see. The dates matched perfectly with Trey's luxury car purchases and his massive losses at the underground poker tables. I looked down at Desmond, my voice cutting through his panicked breathing and the murmurs of the horrified crowd. Vanguard did not offer a $10 million bailout to save you, Desmond. I said, the words echoing clearly across the dead, silent room. It was a Trojan horse audit designed specifically to access your internal servers and expose the rot eating your company alive. It was a targeted operation to prove that Trey has been embezzling $2 million in state taxes. You handed us the keys to your own destruction because you were too arrogant to believe a woman you abused could ever outsmart you. You signed the acquisition papers without reading the liability clauses, transferring the entire burden of Trey's federal fraud directly onto your own shoulders. Desmond's knees finally gave out. The absolute weight of his failure crushed his legs, and he collapsed onto the floor, sitting in a puddle of spilled champagne. His rented tuxedo soaked up the mess as he stared blankly at the screen, reading the undeniable proof of his son's felonies and his own catastrophic negligence. He had spent his entire life building an empire of intimidation and fake wealth, and I had dismantled it completely in under 5 minutes. The investors who had been shaking his hand earlier were now pulling out their phones, frantically calling their own legal teams to distance themselves from the radioactive wreckage of Desmond Logistics. My mother looked down at the man who had tormented her for over a decade, her face perfectly calm, untouched by pity. The suffocating silence of the grand ballroom was suddenly broken by a sound coming from outside the heavy mahogany doors. At first it was just a faint, high-pitched wail drifting through the crisp evening air. But within seconds the sound multiplied and amplified, tearing through the quiet night. The heavy police sirens wailed in the distance, growing deafeningly loud as a massive convoy of vehicles sped up the pristine white gravel of the Oak Ridge Country Club driveway. Red and blue lights began flashing violently through the tall glass windows, painting Desmond's pale, terrified face in the colors of his absolute ruin. The Federal Financial Crimes Unit had arrived right on schedule. The heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom did not just open, they were violently thrust apart by a team of armed federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets. The flashing red and blue lights from the courtyard spilled into the opulent room, casting long, terrifying shadows across the shattered crystal and spilled champagne. The string quartet had long since stopped playing, replaced by the sharp, authoritative voice of a lead detective holding a thick stack of manila folders. He did not ask for permission to enter, he simply marched directly past the shrinking wealthy elite and walked straight up to the stage. His boots struck the marble floor with a heavy, rhythmic thud that sounded like the ticking clock of Desmond's impending doom. The regional bankers and elite socialites who had just been fawning over the logistics empire now scrambled desperately to get out of the way, pulling their silk gowns and tailored tuxedos back to avoid being associated with the nightmare unfolding in front of them. The lead detective raised his voice, cutting through the panicked whispers of the room. He announced that he held a federal warrant for the immediate arrest of Trey on multiple counts of corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand larceny. The private security guards who were still pinning Trey to the marble floor immediately stepped back, allowing the federal agents to haul my terrified stepbrother to his feet. Trey was sobbing openly now, his knees buckling under his own weight, as the cold steel handcuffs clicked sharply around his wrists. He looked frantically toward his father, begging Desmond to do something to call a judge or bribe a politician, but Desmond was completely paralyzed. The man who had always fixed every single one of Trey's catastrophic mistakes was currently staring at his own bankruptcy on the massive projection screens above. Lauren watched her entire glamorous life evaporate before her very eyes. The reality of frozen bank accounts, seized assets, and impending criminal charges finally broke through her massive ego. The sequined dress she wore suddenly felt like a prison uniform as she realized she was married to a federally indicted felon. She looked at the federal agents taking her husband, and then her eyes darted frantically toward me standing above them all on the main stage. In a sickening display of instant hypocrisy, she completely abandoned her earlier disgust and transformed into a desperate weeping victim. She lunged toward the stage, her gaudy dress catching on the steps as she reached out with trembling manicured hands, trying to grab the hem of my silk gown. "Nadia, please," she shrieked, her voice cracking with a pathetic, desperate panic that echoed through the silent ballroom. "We are family. You cannot let them do this. You cannot let them send your brother to prison. You have to stop them. You own the company now. Just tell them it was a misunderstanding." I looked down at her tear-streaked face, feeling absolutely nothing but profound disgust for the woman who had made it her life mission to humiliate me and my mother. I did not step back. I just let her scramble on the steps below me, looking like the exact pathetic charity case she had always accused me of being. I remembered the day I moved out of their sprawling suburban mansion, when she cornered me in the driveway to make sure I left with absolutely nothing. I remembered how she pulled a crumpled $500 bill from her designer purse, threw it directly into my face, and told me to buy some decent clothes so I would not look like such a poor, miserable stray dog. I let that memory hang in the heavy air between us before I leaned closer to the edge of the stage. "You threw $500 in my face and called me poor," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, calm whisper that carried perfectly through the silent room. "You spent years telling your wealthy friends that I was an embarrassment to your reputation. And now suddenly, when the handcuffs come out, I am your sister." I stared directly into her panicked eyes, watching the last shred of her hope completely die. "Your divorce lawyer charges $800 an hour. Lauren," I continued, my voice completely devoid of any mercy, "I highly suggest you call him right now before the federal government seizes your phone as evidence." Lauren recoiled, as if I had physically struck her across the face. She collapsed onto the lower steps of the stage, burying her face in her hands and sobbing hysterically, as her fake friends watched her total destruction without offering a single word of comfort. The federal agents did not waste another second on her theatrical display. They grabbed Trey by his ruined tuxedo jacket and began the long, humiliating perp walk right through the center of the grand ballroom. The city's absolute elite stood in dead silence watching the golden boy of the logistics empire weeping hysterically, stumbling over his own feet as he was marched out into the flashing lights of the police cruisers waiting outside. Desmond could only watch his entire legacy being dragged away in chains. His chest heaved as the oxygen seemed to completely leave the room. He had spent his entire life building an empire of intimidation, fake wealth, and ruthless abuse, and he had just lost it all in front of the very people he worshipped. His face turned a sickly shade of gray, and his hands scrambled desperately at the tight collar of his shirt trying to breathe. The titan of industry let out a ragged, breathless gasp, his eyes rolling back as the sheer shock of his absolute ruin finally hit his heart. He collapsed heavily onto his knees, clutching his chest as his entire stolen world disintegrated right in front of his wealthy peers. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind the federal agents, cutting off the sound of Trey sobbing as he was shoved into the back of a police cruiser. The flashing red and blue lights disappeared into the night, leaving the grand ballroom of the Oak Ridge Country Club bathed in the harsh glare of my projection screens. The absolute silence in the room was suffocating. Nobody moved. The city's financial elite, the bankers, the socialites, the people who had just spent the entire evening kissing Desmond's ring, were now staring at him as if he were a rotting corpse. Desmond was still collapsed on the marble floor, his hands clutching his chest, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. His rented tuxedo was completely ruined, soaked in spilled champagne and his own sweat. His face was a terrifying shade of gray, his eyes wide and vacant as his brain struggled to process the absolute annihilation of his entire existence. I did not feel an ounce of pity for the man bleeding out his dignity on the floor. I felt only the cold, hard satisfaction of a promise fulfilled. I slowly turned away from the massive screens displaying his financial ruin and began my descent from the main stage. My midnight blue silk gown whispered against the velvet steps, the only sound in the cavernous room. Every eye followed my movement, but I only looked at Desmond. The crowd parted for me instinctively, backing away to give me a wide berth. They finally understood exactly who they were dealing with. They understood that the woman they had spent the last hour mocking was the apex predator in the room. I stopped right in front of him, looking down at his trembling form. He tried to push himself backward away from me, his expensive leather shoes slipping uselessly on the slick marble. He looked like a terrified child trapped in the body of a broken old man. I snapped my fingers without looking away from his face. My lead attorney, the man with the frozen steel eyes, stepped forward immediately and placed a massive black leather binder into my outstretched hand. The binder was heavy-packed with hundreds of pages of legal documentation, forensic audits, and property deeds. I held the binder for a moment, letting Desmond stare at it. His eyes darted from the black leather to my face, desperately searching for any sign of mercy. He found none. I opened my hand and let the heavy binder drop directly at his knees. It hit the marble floor with a resounding thud that made several people in the crowd flinch. Desmond flinched violently, pulling his hands back as if the binder were on fire. "Did you honestly think I acquired your rotting logistics company for fun?" "Desmond?" I asked, my voice smooth and lethal, carrying perfectly through the dead silent ballroom. "Did you really believe that a multinational equity firm was interested in a bloated, failing business managed by an embezzling gambling addict? You have spent the last 15 years calling me useless, telling everyone I was a pathetic failure who would amount to nothing. You told my mother I was a financial parasite. But while you were busy spending money, you did not have to impress people who do not actually care about you. I was busy building Vanguard, He stared at the binder, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly, trying to form a sentence that his brain simply could not process. I knelt down slightly, bringing my face closer to his terrified eyes so he could hear every single word with absolute clarity. "That binder contains the complete restructuring of your life," I whispered. "The corporate takeover was just the beginning, Desmond. Vanguard has a very aggressive banking division. And as of yesterday afternoon, we officially purchased 100% of your personal mortgage debt from your previous lenders." Desmond's eyes widened in sheer horror as the realization hit him. He had used his mansion as collateral to secure the fraudulent credit lines keeping his company afloat. He had mortgaged his entire life to maintain the illusion of absolute wealth. "Because your business is officially in default, and the federal government is currently seizing all of your corporate assets, the bank is officially foreclosing on your mansion," I said, my voice rising just enough for the surrounding elite crowd to hear the final nail being driven into his coffin. "The sprawling suburban estate you loved to parade my mother around in the house you used as a weapon to keep her trapped and dependent, that house officially belongs to me now. You are completely destitute, Desmond. You do not own a company, you do not own a car, and you do not even own the bed you sleep in." Desmond let out a pathetic whimpering sound, shaking his head in frantic denial. "No," he gasped, his voice weak and trembling. "No, you cannot do this. You cannot take my house. It is all I have left, Loretta," he croaked, turning his head desperately toward the crowd looking for his wife. "Loretta, please, you have to stop her. She is your daughter. You have to make her stop." He was relying on the exact same tactic he had used for a decade and a half. He believed he could weaponize my mother's fear and her obedience. He believed that if he played the victim, she would step in and shield him from the consequences of his own monstrous actions. He waited for her to rush forward to apologize for my behavior, to beg for my mercy on his behalf. But the woman who stepped out of the shadows of the crowd was not the same terrified, obedient wife he had abused for 15 years. My mother, Loretta, walked slowly onto the open dance floor. Her posture was completely different. The permanent hunch of anxiety she usually carried in her shoulders was entirely gone. She stood tall, her head held high, moving with a quiet, dignified grace that made the wealthy wives watching her look completely inadequate. She walked directly past Lauren, who was still shivering pathetically in the shadows, and came to stand right beside me. Loretta stopped and looked down at the man who had terrorized her, controlled her finances, and tried to crush her spirit. Desmond looked up at her, his eyes begging for salvation, expecting her to cower. For the first time in 15 long, agonizing years, my mother looked her abuser directly in the eye with absolutely zero fear. The raw, absolute power in her gaze made Desmond shrink back even further. She did not look at him with hatred or anger. She looked at him with profound, quiet pity. She had finally seen behind the curtain. She saw that the terrifying titan of industry she had feared for so long was nothing but a weak, pathetic coward hiding behind stolen money. "Loretta, please," Desmond begged again, reaching a shaking hand toward the hem of her dress. "Tell her we are family." Loretta did not step away from his reaching hand. She stood shoulder to shoulder with me, presenting an unbreakable, united front. A soft, genuinely warm smile spread across her face, a smile I had not seen since I was a little girl before this monster had entered our lives. She looked down at the heavy black binder resting against his knees, and then back up to his terrified face. The warmth in her smile never wavered, even as she delivered the final, devastating blow. "You have exactly 24 hours to pack your things, Desmond." The crushing reality of my mother's final deadline hung heavily over the estate for exactly 1 week. The massive wrought iron gates of the mansion were propped wide open, but not to welcome wealthy guests or caterers. A battered rented moving truck sat idling on the pristine cobblestone driveway, leaking a dark puddle of oil onto the stones Desmond used to obsessively have pressure washed. Desmond and Lauren were sweating profusely under the unforgiving afternoon sun, dragging cheap, flimsy cardboard boxes out of the grand mahogany front doors. Their bank accounts were entirely frozen by federal mandate, leaving them absolutely zero access to the millions they had stolen. They could not afford to hire a single mover to haul away the pathetic remnants of their shattered lives. Desmond looked completely unrecognizable from the arrogant corporate titan who had sneered at me just 7 days prior. His face was flushed a dangerous shade of red, and he was gasping for air as he struggled to lift a box of cheap kitchen supplies. He was forced to wear an old faded t-shirt and sweatpants, having surrendered his tailored suits to the Asset Forfeiture Division. Lauren was faring no better. The woman who had once refused to lift anything heavier than a crystal champagne flute was now grunting in pain as she dragged heavy trash bags across the pavement. Her expensive acrylic nails were chipped and broken, and her carefully highlighted hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat. She looked miserable, violently shoving a box into the back of the rusted truck and wiping grime from her face. They were completely alone in their humiliation, but they were certainly being watched. The wealthy neighbors who lived in the surrounding mansions were treating the eviction like an exclusive matinee performance. These were the exact same elite socialites who used to drink Desmond's expensive wine and kiss Lauren's cheeks at their lavish summer garden parties. Now they stood safely behind their custom silk drapes, peering through expensive binoculars, and whispering eagerly about the massive federal fraud investigation. Their judgment was a physical weight pressing down on the driveway. At one point, Eleanor Sterling, a woman who used to beg Lauren for fashion advice, drove her pristine white Range Rover slowly past the open gates. Lauren desperately tried to wave, hoping to salvage a single shred of her former social standing. Eleanor did not even tap the brakes. She simply locked eyes with Lauren, curled her lip in utter disgust, and rolled up her tinted window before accelerating away. The social exile was absolute and final. Desmond and Lauren were no longer just bankrupt. They were a contagious disease that the entire neighborhood was determined to avoid. The sheer physical labor of the move was only the beginning of Desmond's punishment. By late afternoon, he found himself sitting in a cramped, suffocating leasing office located in one of the most dangerous and neglected neighborhoods in the city. The air inside the tiny room smelled strongly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap bleach. A flickering fluorescent light buzzed annoyingly overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow over the stained linoleum floor. The landlord, a burly man who clearly did not care about Desmond's former corporate titles, slid a stack of grimy paperwork across a scratched metal desk. Desmond stared down at the lease agreement for a decaying one-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a building that did not even have a working elevator. The rent was painfully cheap, but even that small amount was going to drain what little cash he had managed to scrape together from pawning his golf clubs. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up a cheap plastic pen to sign his name. The memory of my mother standing tall in the ballroom flashed through his mind as he scrawled his signature on the dotted line. He had spent 15 years forcing her to live in fear of his financial control, and now he was the one signing away his freedom for a rat-infested box in the slums. He handed the papers back, feeling the last ounce of his pride completely evaporate as the landlord tossed him a single sticky brass key. While Desmond was sealing his fate in the slums, Lauren was coming to terms with her own grim reality. She sat in the passenger seat of the rented moving truck, staring at her bruised hands and realizing that the luxurious lifestyle she had married into was completely dead and buried. There would be no more spa days, no more designer handbags, and no more winter vacations in the Alps. The stolen money was entirely gone, seized by Vanguard and the federal government. She was staring down the barrel of a life filled with crushing debt and public disgrace, simply because she was tied to a family of arrogant criminals. Lauren was a survivor above all else, and her survival instinct demanded that she sever the dead weight immediately. She did not drive to the decaying apartment to help Desmond unload the boxes. Instead, she ordered an economy rideshare and headed straight for the county detention center. The heavy concrete building loomed against the gray evening sky, looking like a fortress of misery. She walked through the metal detectors with a cold, calculated expression, carrying nothing but a thin manila folder. She was escorted to the bleak visitation room where the smell of sweat and despair hung thick in the air. She sat down at a scratched metal table separated from the inmate holding area by a thick slab of reinforced glass. A door buzzed loudly, and Trey was led into the room by a heavy-set guard. Trey looked absolutely pathetic. His golden boy image was entirely gone, replaced by the harsh reality of a bright orange jail jumpsuit. His face was bruised from where the country club security had driven his face into the marble floor, and his eyes were red and swollen from days of relentless weeping. He picked up the heavy black receiver on his side of the glass, his hands shaking violently. "Lauren," he sobbed, his voice cracking with desperate relief. "Oh my God, Lauren! You came. You have to get me out of here. It is awful. They are treating me like an animal. You have to call my dad. Tell him to fix this." Lauren picked up the receiver on her side, but her face remained entirely blank. She did not offer a single word of comfort. She did not shed a single tear. She looked at the weeping broken man who had just destroyed her life and felt nothing but cold, hard resentment. She calmly opened the manila folder and slid a thick stack of papers through the narrow metal slot at the bottom of the glass partition. Trey stopped crying for a fraction of a second, looking down at the documents in total confusion. He picked them up, his eyes scanning the bold legal print at the top of the page. His breath caught in his throat as he read the words, "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage." He looked up at Lauren, his face crumpling in absolute shock. "Your father is currently moving into a slum, Trey," she said, her voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "The money is gone. Your country club friends think you are a joke. I am not spending the best years of my life waiting for a convicted felon to rot in a federal cell. Sign the papers, Trey." Trey collapsed against the glass, weeping hysterically as he realized that the absolute ruin of his family was finally complete. While Trey sat weeping in his bright orange jumpsuit, a world away, my mother and I were standing at the very top of the city. My corner office at Vanguard occupied the entire top floor of a sleek downtown skyscraper enclosed entirely by massive floor-to-ceiling glass walls. The morning sun flooded the room, painting the polished mahogany floors and the white leather furniture in brilliant shades of gold. It was a space designed to project absolute authority and untouchable power, but today it felt like a sanctuary. Loretta sat across from my massive desk, looking out over the sprawling city skyline below us. She was wearing a beautiful, soft, cream-colored sweater, her hair neatly styled, and for the first time in my entire life, she looked completely weightless. She did not look like the terrified woman who used to flinch every time a heavy door closed or a voice was raised. She looked like a woman who had finally woken up from a 15-year-long nightmare and realized she was safe. I slid a thick stack of pristine legal documents across the smooth surface of my desk. These were not the frantic, desperate eviction notices Desmond was currently dealing with in the slums. These were papers of liberation meticulously prepared by my elite team of corporate attorneys. The top document was the final, unchallengeable decree of divorce, completely severing my mother from Desmond and his radioactive financial ruin. He had no assets left to fight for, no lawyers left to represent him, and absolutely no power to contest the terms. The second stack of papers was even more important. It contained the ironclad legal framework that officially restored every single penny of my mother's stolen pension fund. For years, Desmond had slowly bled her accounts dry, using her hard-earned money to fund his vanity projects and cover Trey's gambling debts, all while telling her she was entirely dependent on his generosity. My legal team had painstakingly traced every single stolen dollar, clawing it back from his offshore accounts and legally separating it from his seized assets before the federal government could freeze his portfolio. She was not just walking away free, she was walking away whole. Loretta stared down at the documents, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the heavy gold fountain pen I had placed beside them. She read over the divorce decree, tracing her fingers over the bold black letters, as if she needed to physically feel the words, to believe they were actually real. She signed her name on the first dotted line, her signature starting out shaky, but growing stronger and more decisive with every single stroke. Page after page, she dismantled the legal cage Desmond had built around her, isolating her from the world and convincing her she was nothing without him. When she reached the final document securing her financial independence, she slowly set the pen down. The quiet click of the metal against the desk sounded incredibly loud in the peaceful room. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had cooked and cleaned and served a family of monsters for over a decade. A single tear slipped down her cheek, catching the morning light before splashing onto the polished wood of the desk. Then another fell, and suddenly her entire body began to shake. It was not the terrified, panicked weeping I had witnessed so many times in that dark, oppressive mansion. These were heavy, agonizing sobs of profound regret. She covered her face with her hands, the emotional dam finally breaking after years of relentless pressure. "Nadia, I am so sorry," she sobbed, her voice muffled and broken. "I am so incredibly sorry for everything. I let them treat you like dirt for years. I sat there at that long dining room table and watched that man and his awful son humiliate you day after day, and I did absolutely nothing. I was supposed to be your mother. I was supposed to protect you from the monsters, and instead, I forced you to live right under their roof. I was just so weak, Nadia. I was so scared of being poor again, of failing you financially, that I ended up failing you in every other way that actually mattered." I did not say a word. I simply stood up, walked around the massive desk, and knelt on the floor right beside her chair. I reached out and gently pulled her hands away from her tear-streaked face, holding them tightly in my own. I looked directly into her eyes, refusing to let her look away or hide in her shame. "Mom, listen to me," I said, my voice soft but vibrating with absolute certainty. "You survived a man who systematically tried to destroy your mind. You kept us off the streets when things were desperate. You endured 15 years of psychological warfare so that I could have a roof over my head while I got my education. You are not weak, and you never were." I reached up and gently wiped a fresh tear from her cheek with my thumb. "Do not ever let him steal the credit for your survival. You did not fail me. You kept me alive long enough for me to learn how to fight back." I squeezed her hands, leaning in closer, so she would hear nothing but the absolute truth in my words. "Do you remember the text message you sent me exactly 2 months ago?" I asked quietly. "The one that simply said, 911 Pine." Her breath caught in her throat as she remembered the exact moment I was talking about. For years, Desmond had meticulously monitored her phone, her emails, and her movements, keeping her entirely isolated from the outside world and from me. But that specific night, when Desmond had violently thrown a heavy crystal tumbler at her in his study, shattering it against the vintage pine bookshelf, she had finally found the courage to reach out. She had managed to steal his burner phone from his suit jacket pocket while he was passed out in a drunken stupor, lock herself in the guest bathroom, and send me that single desperate coded message in the middle of the night. "That text was the exact moment I knew you were finally ready to be free," I explained, my eyes locked onto hers. "That was the moment I authorized Vanguard to initiate the hostile takeover and begin buying up his corporate debt. If you had not found the incredible bravery to send that message, knowing the terrible physical and financial danger you would be in if he woke up and caught you, I could never have executed this plan. You handed me the key to our cage, Mom. That single terrifying act of defiance was the ultimate act of strength, and it was the spark that burned his entire empire to the ground. You saved us." Loretta stared at me, her eyes wide as the truth of my words slowly washed over her. The heavy, suffocating guilt that had plagued her for years began to visibly dissolve, yielding to a fragile, beautiful sense of pride. She realized that she was not just a passive victim waiting to be rescued. She had been an active participant in her own liberation. She had taken the first terrifying step in the dark, and I had simply built the bridge to catch her. She let out a long, shaky breath, wiping the remaining moisture from her eyes and nodding slowly. A genuine, brilliant smile finally broke through the sorrow, completely transforming her face. The heavy years of abuse seemed to physically melt away, leaving her looking beautiful, untethered, and completely at peace. I stood up and walked over to the elegant wet bar situated against the far glass wall of the office. The city stretched out behind me, a sprawling kingdom of concrete and glass that we now officially commanded. I pulled a bottle of perfectly chilled vintage champagne from the small cooler, feeling the cold condensation against my palms. The soft pop of the cork echoed in the spacious office, a sound of pure, unadulterated victory. I poured the golden bubbling liquid into two tall crystal flutes, carrying them back to where my mother sat. She stood up to meet me, her posture straight, her eyes clear and bright, shining with the promise of a life that finally belonged entirely to her. I handed her a glass and raised my own toward the morning sun. We did not need to make a long dramatic speech or recount the miseries of the past. We simply clinked our glasses together, the sharp, clear ring of the crystal sealing the end of the nightmare. We took a slow sip of the vintage champagne, tasting the sweet, intoxicating flavor of our new, completely untethered freedom. 6 months passed since the night the Oak Ridge Country Club witnessed the absolute destruction of Desmond and his empire. The seasons had changed, and the bitter winter had finally given way to a bright and suffocatingly hot summer. My life had transformed into a seamless sequence of board meetings, global acquisitions, and quiet evenings spent in the massive glass-walled penthouse I now shared with my mother. Vanguard had grown exponentially under my direct control, and the local financial journals had long since stopped calling me a fluke. They now referred to me as the most ruthless corporate architect in the city. But despite the private jets and the endless stream of luxury, I still found comfort in the simple mundane tasks that kept me grounded. It was a sweltering Tuesday afternoon when I decided to stop at a cheap discount grocery store on the outskirts of the city. My personal driver had parked the sleek black Maybach right by the curb, the engine humming quietly as the air conditioning kept the luxurious leather interior perfectly chilled. I stepped out into the blazing heat wearing a simple linen dress and flat sandals, looking entirely out of place among the cracked asphalt and faded storefronts. I just wanted some fresh local produce, something unpretentious and real. The automatic glass doors slid open, greeting me with a blast of artificial cold air and the overwhelming scent of cheap floor wax. The fluorescent lights above flickered erratically, casting a harsh, pale glare over the scuffed linoleum aisles. I grabbed a green plastic basket and made my way toward the back of the store, navigating around dented shopping carts and displays of heavily discounted canned goods. I was admiring the bruised but fragrant peaches when I heard the unmistakable squeak of a heavy plastic wheel. A large yellow mop bucket was being dragged down the aisle toward me, the soapy gray water sloshing over the sides and hitting the floor. The man pushing the bucket was moving with a slow, agonizing stiffness. His shoulders were hunched forward under the weight of an oversized blue uniform shirt that hung loosely over his shrinking frame. The fabric was stained with bleach and sweat clinging to his skin in patches. He was muttering under his breath, staring blindly at the dirty floor as he pushed the heavy wet mop back and forth in slow mechanical circles. I stepped back to give the worker some space, but the heel of my sandal clipped a fallen display box. The slight noise made the janitor stop his monotonous work and look up. His dull, sunken eyes met mine, and the entire world seemed to freeze under the buzzing fluorescent lights. It was Desmond. The man standing before me was a hollowed-out shell of the terrifying billionaire who had tormented my mother and me for 15 years. The past 6 months in the slums had aged him 2 decades. His thick silver hair, which used to be perfectly coiffed by expensive stylists, was now thin, greasy, and plastered to his skull. Deep purple bags hung under his bloodshot eyes, and the arrogant sneer that used to define his face had collapsed into a permanent slack-jawed grimace of exhaustion. His hands, the same hands that used to slam heavy fists onto mahogany dining tables, were wrapped tightly around the wooden handle of the mop, trembling violently. A cheap plastic name tag was pinned crookedly to his chest, reading Desmond in faded black marker. He stared at me, his jaw working silently, as his brain struggled to process the impossibility of this encounter. He looked at my flawless skin, my relaxed posture, and the quiet, absolute power that radiated from my mere existence. His eyes darted downward, catching the glint of metal resting casually on my wrist. It was a genuine, solid gold Rolex, a timepiece that cost more than what he now made in 3 years of scrubbing floors. He stared at the watch, his breath catching in his throat, as the memory of his own lost luxury washed over him. Desmond swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing painfully in his throat as he slowly turned his head to look past me. Through the smudged glass storefront windows, he could perfectly see the gleaming black Maybach idling against the curb. He saw the suited driver standing at attention by the rear door waiting patiently for my return. He saw the undeniable proof of the empire I had built while he was busy tearing his own life to pieces. The realization of his absolute permanent ruin broke whatever tiny fraction of pride he had left. The mop handle slipped from his wet fingers and clattered loudly onto the linoleum floor. The sharp noise echoed through the empty aisle, but neither of us broke eye contact. Desmond slumped forward slightly, his shoulders shaking as the reality of his pathetic existence crushed the breath out of his lungs. He looked back at me, his eyes welling up with thick, desperate tears. He saw the daughter he had thrown away, the woman he had called useless, the billionaire who now owned every single piece of debt attached to his miserable life. In a final pathetic attempt to manipulate the past, he reached his trembling wet hand toward me, his fingernails caked in cheap industrial soap. "Daughter," he whispered, his voice, a cracked, broken rasp that barely carried over the hum of the store refrigerators. It was a plea for mercy, a beg for salvation, a desperate hope that the title of family would magically produce a handout to save him from his absolute hell. I did not blink. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or anger or even triumph. I felt nothing but the profound emptiness you feel when looking at a stranger you will never see again. I slowly reached into my small leather purse, unzipping the main compartment. Desmond's eyes widened in hungry anticipation, watching my hand emerge. I pulled out a crisp new $100 bill. Desmond let out a ragged breath, his hand reaching out a little further, his fingers twitching in desperate greed. He thought I was going to save him. He thought I was going to hand him a lifeline, just like he always expected my mother to do whenever he made a mistake. I moved my hand deliberately past his outstretched fingers, ignoring him completely. Right next to his dirty mop bucket sat a clear plastic charity donation box, collecting spare change for a local animal shelter. I held the crisp bill over the narrow slot and let it flutter down into the plastic container. Desmond's arm dropped to his side, his mouth falling open in a silent scream of ultimate humiliation. He realized in that exact moment that he was completely invisible to me. He was not a father, he was not an enemy, he was simply an obstacle in aisle 4. I looked him directly in his weeping, broken eyes, my face completely blank. "Work hard," I said, my voice calm and perfectly steady. I picked up my basket of peaches, stepped carefully over the puddle of dirty mop water, and walked out of the store into the bright summer sun, leaving him to rot in the mess he had created. The heavy metal door of the visitation room slammed shut behind Lauren, leaving Trey to his fate. But I was miles away, breathing in the fresh evening air. I stood on the expansive wrap-around balcony of my penthouse, the warm evening breeze gently tugging at the hem of my silk dress. The city stretched out below me, a glittering ocean of lights. But for the very first time, it did not look like a battlefield. It just looked peaceful. I looked down over the glass railing toward the sprawling private terrace below. My mother Loretta was kneeling on a thick, cushioned mat, surrounded by massive blueprints and blooming jasmine plants. She was happily sketching out the landscape architecture for the massive new private estate I had just purchased, completely in her name. There was a smudge of dirt on her cheek and a pencil tucked behind her ear. She was humming a quiet song to herself, completely absorbed in creating something beautiful. There were no more screaming matches echoing through the halls. There were no more toxic comparisons to wealthy neighbors, and no more walking on eggshells, wondering what mood the man of the house would be in. There was just absolute unbreakable peace. I smiled, resting my hands on the cool glass railing, and took a slow sip of my vintage wine. Looking at my mother's radiant face, I finally understood the profound truth of what we had accomplished. The ultimate revenge was never about shouting the loudest or matching their cruelty blow for blow. It was about completely stripping them of their power, starving them of a reaction, and building a brilliantly successful life they will never have the privilege to touch. The most powerful lesson from this story is that true liberation does not come merely from financial success or punishing those who hurt you. It comes from breaking the cycle of abuse and reclaiming your own self-worth. For years, Loretta and Nadia were trapped by fear and manipulation. Desmond used money and psychological warfare to keep them chained. However, their ultimate victory was not just taking his empire, but finding the courage to fight back. True strength is built in those dark moments when you decide to stop being a victim and finally take control of your own destiny. If you have ever had to break free from a toxic situation to reclaim your power, share your story of resilience in the comments below.